Hello, I'm Layne Hartsell with the Korea Industry and Technology Times. I'm here with Max Wilbert, who's a writer and biocentric community organizer. He's been part of a grassroots political work for 20 years and is the founder of Project Thacker Pass. Thacker Pass is in Nevada. He's the author of two books, most recently Bright Green Lies, which I've talked about here on the series before, How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way, by Monkfish 2021, and he's currently studying for a master's degree in degrowth. Max, welcome back to Technics and Civilization.
Great to be here, Layne. Thanks for having me.
Today I want to go more in depth. We've talked about lithium in the past and what they call white gold. So there's a white gold rush going on, generally recognized by everybody from the Financial Times to the activists, community organizers like yourself. Land grab, human rights abuses, ecological destruction, all part of it, just as mining has happened over thousands of years. I also want to say that Max and I are working on a paper together with an African agroecologist on lithium mining in the Congo. That is kind of part of the interview tonight. And that paper should be out probably later this year. I want to give an introduction so people listening can understand the nature of mining, and then I'm going to ask Max about his experience and also maybe some technical questions like I've done in the past. So I want to say, first of all, that pollution history of the atmosphere of the Northern Hemisphere is recorded in levels of heavy metals, impurities in Greenland ice. We know where the heavy metals are coming from. Spain was famous for its prodigious output of silver during ancient times. So silver was actually more important than gold for a lot of history. And this is particularly in southern Spain at Rio Tinto in the west and at Cartagena in the east. Spain became Rome's greatest silver producing region. Later, around the time of Venice, 1500 or so, at the end of Venice and the European expansion into the New World, Potosi in Bolivia was a location of large silver mines, massive growth and economy. It was also referred to as the man-eating mines, echoing the Roman saying, damnatio et metallo, death in the metal, death in the metal mines. A lot of that comes from the toxic chemicals that they were using that are still around. Max, you quote Professor Stephen H. Zimmerman, an independent hydrologist working on the issues that you're working on, Thacker Pass in upper northern Nevada near Oregon. He called Lithium America, the corporation, their toxic tailings. Tailings are what are dug out of the earth and put aside. Their storage plan for these toxic tailings, which was also what I was talking about with Cartagena and Rio Tinto in Spain from Roman and Carthage and also Phoenician times. Those tailings are toxic. He says, Dr. Emmerman says, this is reckless creativity, not based in science, and believes there is a significant chance of either catastrophic failure or gradual leakage of pollution into the water table for thousands of years. First of all, I want to start off with this and get your comment on this, and then I want you to ask you to talk a little bit about how you got involved and your background.
Yeah, absolutely, Layne. Well, thank you again for having me. The material that you just shared is really important, and I want to start by addressing what Professor Emmerman talked about with regards to the Thacker Pass lithium mine specifically. Most mines around the world until very, very recently have used a wet tailings storage method where all of the waste that's left over from processing copper or gold or silver or lead or lithium or any other materials out of rock and soil is stored behind dams in a form that is like a dense but liquid mud, sort of a slurry. And there are places, I used to live in Salt Lake City, for example. One of the largest copper mines in the world is right next to Salt Lake City. And if you drive west on Interstate 80 out of Salt Lake City across the Salt Flats and into Nevada, eventually to Reno in the Bay Area, you pass by these massive tailings dams on the south side of the highway there. These dams are a few hundred feet tall and go on for maybe several miles. So there's a massive amount of material that's impounded behind these dams. And below you on the other side is the Great Salt Lake, which is a wetland that's of international importance to migratory birds. The Great Salt Lake has, of course, been in the news lately because it's drying up. And this is an ecological disaster, a dust bowl in the making for the whole Salt Lake Valley, which is home to millions and millions of people, because too much water is being taken. So they're trying to keep these toxic mine tailings out of the wetland by keeping them locked behind these tailings dams. That's the traditional technology. It has major problems. We've seen these dams collapse in different areas of the world. There was a major dam collapse in Brazil several years ago, which killed several people and destroyed hundreds of miles of streams and rivers in the area. And there was a major collapse at Mount Polley, which is a mine in British Columbia, Canada, a number of years before that flooded into some pristine rivers and lakes that were previously some of the best salmon fishing in the world, that have now been toxified for likely hundreds of years, if not far more, by these toxic mine tailings which spilled into these waterways. So Lithium Nevada at Thacker Pass is attempting a new technology that is being adopted in different places and tested out in different places by the global mining industry. And it's called a dry tailing stack. And what they mean to do here is reduce the moisture content of their waste material. So all the rock, the soil, the sediments that aren't lithium, after they're done processing and extracting the lithium out using a sulfuric acid process, they want to put that onto a giant, basically build a new mountain, 500 or 600 feet tall, of all this toxic material, line the bottom of it with a plastic sheet, essentially, a rubberized sheet, to try and prevent water seeping through it into the groundwater and bringing all the toxicity into the groundwater from sulfuric acid, from toxic materials that are currently inside the soil, safely locked away, but will be, mobilized and freed to go into dust and water and air and so on by the mining process, by the fact that they're blowing up and plowing and bulldozing all this soil. These naturally occurring elements that are safely locked in the rock and underground for now are going to be exposed and brought up to the surface. And that includes arsenic, uranium, various other radioactive compounds, heavy metals, quite a few toxins. So this dry tailing stack technology basically relies on keeping the moisture at a relatively low level. But it's not, this technology is new. And Stephen Emmerman, Dr. Emmerman, is a hydrologist who studies these types of things, who studies, for example, how soils liquefy once you get to a certain percentage of moisture. Then what was once a solid will begin to act like a liquid and flow. I mean, this is how landslides work. This is how, if people live in earthquake zones and they've heard about liquefaction of, for example, reclaimed areas in bays. I grew up in Seattle, and there's a lot of downtown Seattle has been built on what was once Elliott Bay, but they filled in the ocean with dirt and old chunks of concrete and whatever spare material they had laying around. That has its own very serious negative ecological effects. But in an earthquake, the danger is liquefaction, where all of a sudden that ground that seems solid gets inundated with water in the pore spaces between all these different, all this sand and all this material, and it just turns to a liquid, essentially, and that's a real disaster in a major earthquake scenario. And I'm not familiar with it, but I'm sure that all across the Pacific Rim and in other earthquake-prone regions of the world, there's been a lot of reclamation around major cities, and that this liquefaction is a serious danger. So at Thacker Pass, Professor Emmerman is bringing up this idea that that this technology is untested, it's unproven, it's unknown if it will work, and he does not think it will work. He actually gave a very cutting presentation where he called this reckless creativity, their technology, their approach to this toxic tailings issue. And he said they don't really have a plan for it. The plan that they submitted to the state, which they're required to submit a plan for, this is how we're going to keep toxins out of the water and so on. He said that plan was very incomplete, that it was not scientifically sound, and he made detailed comments to the state to that effect. Of course, unfortunately, his comments were ignored, and the mine was permitted to move forward. So that's just one of the technical, scientific dangers that's posed by the Thacker Pass mine. But I think, especially for this audience, it's an important one to bring up. One point that I do want to say is, regardless of whether or not they have a problem with this tailing stack in the end, the mine is an ecological disaster. The harms caused by this mine are not going to be proven or disproven by whether or not there's a tailings accident or failure of some sort. It's already an ecological disaster, and they haven't even started building this tailing stack yet. They're already bulldozing thousands and thousands of acres of this beautiful, very biodiverse, and also very culturally important to indigenous people and to the local communities. This place is being destroyed as we speak, unfortunately.
Presumably, you got involved with Thacker Pass. You founded this project due to this background that you said you had seen the copper mines and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about how you got involved? How did you get to this point?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I got interested in environmental issues at a pretty young age. Growing up, I was very blessed to be brought out camping and brought out to wild places, some of the amazing world-renowned beauty of the Pacific Northwest, places like Mount Rainier National Park and the wilderness beaches in Washington State and the North Cascades, which people call the Alps of North America. Just these stunning places that you can't help but fall in love with. And when you spend time in the wild and then you go back to the city, you can't help but see the problems. You can't help but see that skyscrapers are not sequestering carbon and filtering water by their life. They are in fact polluting water and destroying the air, contributing to air pollution and global warming in various different ways through their construction and maintenance and so on. So this contrast started to become more and more clear to me throughout the course of my life. I got involved in environmental work and activism, and for many years it was what you would consider mainstream environmental activism, focused on lobbying government and personal lifestyle changes. I don't think that those approaches are terrible ideas or are bad in any way, but I do think that they're inadequate now. And so at a certain point, I began to shift in a more systemic direction, trying to analyze these issues with a broader perspective and trying to figure out where are our biggest levers to affect change. How do we actually gain the leverage that we need to shift the course, not just of our individual lives and our individual impacts, but of society as a whole? And that led me to a broader analysis of environmentalism and to getting involved in the radical environmental movement, radical in the sense of going to the root of the problem. And that was around 2009, 2010 that I started to make that shift. And since then, it's been 15 years, and I've been working as hard as I can ever since to try and save our planet in all kinds of different ways. So I work now with Protect Thacker Pass. I'm also part of a group called Deep Green Resistance. I'm a writer and published a couple books, including Bright Green Lies, which you mentioned in the introduction. I'm involved in a variety of different campaigns on other issues as well, unrelated to mining, things like logging and forest destruction issues, and so on. And I've been involved in fighting a lot of fossil fuel projects as well. I think that's important for people to know because it's easy to assume that anyone who's opposed to lithium mining must be a global warming denier. Because that's the narrative that's being put out there, and the unfortunate reality is, as we know, the fossil fuel industry has poured money, and fossil fuel interests have poured money into undermining climate science, resisting political solutions or projects that are pushing towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. That is a very real danger. And global warming is an absolute crisis. It's very clear to me. I was lucky to be able to travel to the Arctic in 2010 with climate scientists who were studying and doing research on global warming in the Arctic, which is being hit harder and faster than almost anywhere else in the world. And so had a chance to work with and document the work that these scientists were doing firsthand and see thawing permafrost and methane bubbling out of these lakes as the ground is thawing underneath them, and so on. So I want to make that clear that global warming is an absolute crisis, and I've been both involved in directly working to stop the burning of fossil fuels around the planet, and am very supportive of anyone who's doing that work. At the same time, I think that many of the mainstream solutions that are being offered around things like electric vehicles with lithium batteries, wind and solar energy, and so on, are vastly inadequate to address the problem that we're facing with global warming and more broadly the ecological crisis.
Trying to think, there's a lot of different directions to go. Today in Latin America, particularly Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, and those areas, there's massive lithium deposits, Salar de Uyuni, the Salar de Atacama or Acama. Did I say it right? Yeah.
Atacama, yeah.
Atacama. The native people say we are like rocks on the road kicked away for the lithium fields and mining. We don't eat batteries, they say, and water is necessary for life in the dry desert. You're working right shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand with Native American peoples. You are them. Can you comment on the condition of the Native American communities that you visited, that you live with, so on?
Yeah, so I've worked with Native communities in what's now the United States off and on for many years on different issues. And at Thacker Pass, when we first went out there, my friend Will Falk and I first set up a protest camp on the site of this planned mine back in January of 2021. We didn't actually know any of the Native people from that area right around Thacker Pass. It was during the COVID pandemic. A lot of reservations were really locked down. Communication wasn't very easy. And so we tried to reach out to some Native people, but weren't really able to connect with people in the direct area around Thacker Pass. So we went out there anyway, thinking, we're going to continue to try to build these relationships as we begin fighting this mine publicly, as we establish this protest camp, start talking to the media, trying to organize the communities against this. And that's exactly what happened. A group of traditional indigenous folks started reaching out to us. They came out to the camp. We started building some relationships. Very soon, very, very soon, it became apparent that Thacker Pass was a highly significant cultural site to Northern Paiute and Western Shoshone people who live in that area, due to a long history of their people using that land for hunting and gathering, for ceremonies, for campsites, for everyday life, and also for two grimmer incidents that happened there. The first one, excuse me, The first one occurred in prehistory. We don't have pre-European history, pre-written history. It's not prehistory. I should correct myself, because this event is clearly recorded in the oral history of the Northern Paiute and Western Shoshone people, and so it's not prehistory, as it's often framed. But this event was part of a conflict between two tribes. So it was Northern Paiute folks who were living in the area around Thacker Pass, and another tribe from the west in what's now California. And that tribe had come over to the Paiute territory to raid, and they had attacked a Paiute camp located in Thacker Pass. Well, the hunters and the stronger fighters were away from the camp hunting on the east side of a mountain range. And they killed a bunch of people. These raiders killed a bunch of people, and they took some captives, and they they did something very gruesome, which was they cut open people's guts and strew them across the sagebrush, across the bushes. And then they left, and they headed back towards their territory with their captives. So the hunters came back from their hunting, and they found their relatives and their families, kids and parents and grandparents, and they found them dead. And so this led to Thacker Pass being named Rotten Moon in Paiute, Pahimaha. And it's called Rotten Moon because of the smell of these people decomposing after this massacre. And the moon refers to the shape, from what I've been told, refers to the shape of Thacker Pass. It's not a narrow, steep mountain pass like this. It's more of a broad saddle that's shaped like this. And so the hunters and warriors, they tracked the war party from this other tribe. They followed them. They eventually caught up with them, and they staged a daring rescue and got the captives back. So that was the end of that particular saga. But of course, the drama wasn't over, because the white settlers came to Nevada first in the 1850s. And in the 1860s, colonization really started to pick up steam. So by the year 1864, there were quite a few white settlers in Nevada. They were settling in the most valuable ecological places first. They were taking the best habitat, essentially. So Nevada's a pretty dry place. So they were taking the places with good water, with good trees for fuel and firewood and building and so on. The places where there was abundant grass and native plants for horses and cattle to eat. And they, of course, they had guns. They had an organized army protecting them, the United States military. And so this led to conflict with the native people. So in 1864, the Snake War broke out, which was a war between the Paiutes, the Shoshone, and some of the other regional communities and nations as well, against the United States government. It's a very poorly known war, despite the fact that it was the bloodiest war, the bloodiest Indian war west of the Mississippi. So this is a significant war in American history that took place from 1864 to 1868. Thousands of people were killed on both sides of this conflict, and it's basically unknown, basically completely unknown. We didn't know about it when we first went to Thacker Pass, but we started to hear about these oral histories from elders and members of the communities. That led us to read some of the obscure history books that talk about this war, to find some of the primary source documents, the old newspaper articles and accounts, letters written by the soldiers and so on, to dig into the archives at some of the university libraries and so on. And this is particularly relevant, the Snake War, to Thacker Pass, because on September 12th, 1865, so the second year of the Snake War, a group of Paiutes was camped at Thacker Pass right next to a place called Sentinel Rock, which is a rock outcrop on the east side of Thacker Pass. and a very culturally important site. And a group of soldiers, the 1st Nevada Cavalry, they spotted the campfires of this group. Overnight, they rode across the valley by starlight and moonlight. They crossed the valley, and they got in position and attacked this Paiute camp at dawn on September 12th, 1865. And so it was a surprise attack on a group of, a mixed group, family groups, men, women, children, elders. It's believed that they killed at least 31 and possibly 50, possibly as many as 70 Paiutes in this attack. None of the white soldiers were killed. 1 or 2 were injured, but they survived their injuries. And this account is very well referenced in historical literature. There's numerous newspaper articles that describe what happened. And what they describe is soldiers attacking from the east, the native folks being surprised, many of them being killed, but many of them continuing to flee to the west and to the northwest, away from the direction the soldiers came, because when people get attacked, they run. And this fight went on for hours. This massacre went on for hours and took place across many miles. This is significant because during the whole struggle to protect Thacker Pass over the last 3 years, several tribes from around the region, 3 tribes, brought lawsuits against the federal government saying you should not have permitted the destruction of Thacker Pass for this lithium mine. You should not have allowed this. You should not have issued a permit to the mining company. And one of their arguments revolved around this massacre site and the cultural significance of that, the fact that there are likely, certainly, human remains, bones, skulls, people's blood into the soil. It's a graveyard. It's a burial site. It's a significant battle site, no different than Gettysburg, in the site of the American Civil War battle, or I'm sure that it's the case in Korea or anywhere around the world that some significant battle sites where major battles took place they're marked. There are interpretive signs and plaques. There are protected areas for people. There are museums. That history is preserved because it's important. People's ancestors fought and died and gave their lives in these areas, and they should not just be destroyed willy-nilly, just like a graveyard shouldn't be bulldozed. So this, as people fled, they fled deeper and deeper into what's now the Thacker Pass lithium mine site, what's currently being bulldozed and destroyed for the lithium mine. The government essentially tried to make the argument in court that the massacre began just outside the current project area. And when I say just outside, I mean 100 meters outside the project area is where the massacre began. And they said because of that, that's the massacre site, and it doesn't matter because it's not in the project area. Again, all the historical documents are very clear that people fled and fought back and died on this land for hours and across many miles, many kilometers of terrain. But the judge sided with the mining company, sided with the federal government, and rejected the tribal lawsuits against the project. Of course, law in the United States is not strong at all. So even had that lawsuit succeeded, it wouldn't have stopped the project completely. But it would have slowed things down significantly. It would have forced the federal government and the mining company to go back and do some things with a lot more precision, to consult, to have detailed conversations with the tribes, and try and avoid destroying or impacting these culturally significant areas. So needless to say, Layne, to get back to your question, this area is very significant to Native American people, and it's not just the nearest tribes. So currently in Nevada and across much of the United States, tribes are organized into tribal governments, with tribal councils, because of federal U.S. laws that were passed in the 1800s and the early 20th century. Those laws do not reflect the traditional way that these cultures were organized.
Mhm.
So what I mean by that is that the closest tribe to Thacker Pass is the Fort McDermott Paiute Shoshone tribe. It's only about 20 miles away from Thacker Pass, 20 or 30 kilometers. The There are people, Paiute and Shoshone people, living 200 miles, 300 miles, 400 miles away from Thacker Pass, who are directly related and are direct descendants of the people who were killed at Thacker Pass on September 12th, 1865. So the tribal governments do not correspond to the traditional territories, to the bands and so on, the government that existed before colonization. It's a new system that was imposed after the Snake War, decades after the Snake War. And so this is why you have three tribes, some of whom were located pretty far away from Thacker Pass, suing to try and stop the project. And you actually had about a dozen tribes across Nevada and across the region speaking out publicly in opposition to this lithium mine, saying that Thacker Pass is very significant and sacred to us. And you even had the National Congress of American Indians, the largest group composed of all the Indian nations in the United States, passing a resolution opposing the destruction of Thacker Pass. So, very, very significant place. And, it's been a blessing to, despite the fact that we've been unsuccessful in our struggle thus far, one of the blessings of this whole project has been building some very strong relationships and friendships with members of these tribes and native communities across Nevada and across the region. It became very apparent when we got out there and started talking with people and building these relationships that there were a lot of shared values around the importance of protecting land, the importance of water, the importance of connection to place, and that a purely materialist, profit-driven approach to extraction and to human relationship with landscapes and with the places we live and the creatures that we live around is ultimately a suicidal project. It's self-destructive in the long run, and it cannot continue. That's the definition of unsustainable.
I want to take the argumentative position. The Lithium America Corporation representative Tim Crowley said he's unaware that the company has any problems with protesters in other countries or whatever. But what you're describing to me, this is a history that goes back to 1865 as far as the U.S. is concerned, and there's camps there right now. I mean, obviously, what you're saying is known. How could a company representative not know this? I mean, this is like big company. They're right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, just to give people some context, Tim Crowley is the vice president of government relations for Lithium Nevada Corporation, which is the subsidiary of Lithium Americas that's based in the United States. Tim Crowley used to work for the Nevada Mining Association, and his father was the head of the University of Nevada, Reno. So Tim Crowley comes from old big money in Nevada. He comes from the Old Boys Club, and he is intimately linked to the mining industry and the mining industry's efforts to get more subsidies from the state and federal governments, undermine environmental protections, bypass and undermine any community opposition to mining from environmental groups, community groups, tribes, and generally do whatever the mining industry wants. He is, in my view, a very corrupt and a very corrupt person. And I have heard him deceive and perhaps even lie directly to community members in face-to-face in community meetings that I attended where he was also present. One example of this is that at a community meeting with people who are very concerned with the impacts of the Thacker Pass mine, whenever he was talking about any sort of positive impact that the mine could be said to have, like bringing jobs to the community, he would use the numbers from what's called phase 2 of the mine, which is going to be done by 2030 or after. It's when the mine would be fully built and operational at the highest level. So he would use these positive numbers from, almost 10 years in the future, and he would say there are going to be this many jobs. It's going to have this much tax benefit for the county, and so on. Then when he was talking about any sort of negative impacts like air pollution or the number of trips that large trucks will be making up and down the small road that all the community members use as well. Whenever he was talking about these negative impacts, he would use numbers from phase 1 of the mine construction, which is when essentially it's only half built. That's, the early stage of mine construction between 2026 and 2030 or so, when the mine is operating at half capacity. And so I heard him do this with my own ears. And I knew, because I had read the environmental impact statement, I had studied these numbers. So I knew, and we exposed this to the community. We told everyone about this. But he was deliberately deceiving people by, giving them the rosiest possible perspective of the positive impacts and covering up the true scale and scope of the negative impacts. That, to me, is profoundly immoral behavior. And it's representative more broadly of what Lithium Americas and Lithium Nevada have done at Thacker Pass and what the mining industry does all over the world. Until recently, Lithium Americas Corporation, which is based in Canada, had 2 different wings. One of those wings was Lithium Nevada, working to construct the Thacker Pass mine. The other wing was Lithium Argentina, which is working in a community in Argentina to develop a lithium extraction project there. Recently, they split these operations into 2 different companies. So they're now separate legal entities. There's Lithium Argentina and there's Lithium Americas. And they're completely separate according to the law.
Okay, so I want to just, for journalist integrity, so it could be that Mr. Crowley didn't quite know about the problems in other countries, although that would almost be impossible too, but there's plausible denial there, but not for the other deceit that's going on, which you guys have the goods on for there. I just wanted to make a comment there, because his quote from the Reno Gazette Journal, Mark Robinson's article, says that he's unaware if the company has any problems with protesters in other countries. So I want to make that clear. Yep. Thanks.
Yeah, there's plausible deniability there, but I think he's lying through his teeth. At that time, the 2 companies were combined still. They were still one company. And he's the vice president of the company. He's in these meetings. He knows what's going on. That very month, there are mass protests taking place in Argentina, prompted by the abuses of lithium mining companies like Lithium Argentina in these communities in Argentina. The environmental problems they're causing, all the water that they're using, the corruption happening in government, all of these issues that are associated with lithium mining. So to me, the idea that a vice president of the company did not know the very month that these activities, these mass protests are happening, and we're talking road blockades, activists being arrested and tortured and sexually abused, people setting tires on fire, intensive protests, high intensity conflict.
People walk to Buenos Aires, right?
People walk hundreds of kilometers to Buenos Aires to take part in mass protests in the capital. I mean, this is major issues. So it is completely unfathomable to me that he did not know this was going on. And to anyone who's following these issues and knows Tim Crowley and knows his ethics, it's clear that he's lying through his teeth.
Now that we're on the topic, of course, this connects to Latin America. Of course, this was Turtle Island, what you're talking about in the north, and then of course going to the southern hemisphere. The project you're talking about is Coachari Olaroz, is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
So Lithium America is involved in there. They're also partnering with a Chinese company. Is that correct? It's an
Yeah.
American company partnering with a Chinese company
Yeah.
to exploit the resources. Now, let me. When we began the interview, I talked about Potosi, Bolivia, the first major boom for mining in the area. Uh, this goes back further, right? Because the European expansion, many people don't realize that Columbus's his voyages. Well, the first one came over. They landed in the Bahamas or around that area, Hispaniola. But he went back and he came back with something like 38 ships, and then they went around the basin there, the Caribbean. Uh, and this was basically a mining operation, speculative kind of mining operation. If you read some of the some of the core tech magazines today, like something like Wired or Tech Dirt, or I see the CEOs praising Columbus that well, he did some bad stuff, but I honor him anyway because he's the preeminent entrepreneur. I'm quoting CEOs of companies. Now, uh, we have people like Tim Crowley. I'm sorry, Tim Crowley.
Hmm.
Uh, we have a pedigree going back hundreds of years, connecting, say, Potosi with, Thacker Pass,
Hmm.
connecting Potosi with Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia. Uh, the Bolivia underwent a coup,
Hmm.
uh, very bad coup, just a couple years ago. The government was taken over by a religious Christian fundamentalist group. They brought a Bible into the rotunda, the Capitol. They did a kind of seance, getting out the evil communists or whatever they want to call them. This was a democratic elected government
Hmm.
in Bolivia, one of the first and only Native Americans in 500, more than 500 years that has been president, Evo
Hmm.
Morales. Corrupt, yes, but this is a democratic election. Overthrown, immediately the government liquidates Native American communities. Now, these communities are living in lands where mining is occurring. Is this correct? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so the case of Bolivia is really interesting because Evo Morales is, certainly not perfect by any means, but yet is an example, like many governments around the world, of this sort of nationalist socialism that has largely, on the national stage, international stage, has been the only large scale alternative to sort of the hegemony of American imperialism and Western capitalism. Um, and we've seen these governments be toppled one by one by the United States and Western powers over decades now. Um, and of course, Bolivia was famous a decade or two ago for the water wars that took place there when they tried to privatize the water supply. Halliburton Corporation tried to privatize the water supply in Bolivia, in large parts of Bolivia, in the capital, and triggered these mass protests in the streets. So, you know, so so Evo Morales was also part of what's called the Pink Tide, which is this sort of socialist nationalist wave of governments across South America that were nationalizing resources and using the funds to reduce poverty and so on. I have a lot of problems with that approach because I think if you're funding an industrial modernity based on destroying the land, um, you may be destroying just as much as you would under a capitalist system. I mean, that's debatable, and I don't know all the specifics of Bolivia. I'm not a historian or a political theorist who knows the details of what they did there. But we have seen around the world in different socialist countries, some socialist countries, just as much ecological destruction, if not more, as we've seen under capitalism. That's not true across the board, but it is true in some cases. So nonetheless, what you saw in Bolivia with the coup was a very clear capitalist state intervention, apparently. And most famously, after the coup, Elon Musk was confronted online about about the fact that some of the incentive for this coup was driven by demand for Western corporations to get into Bolivia's lithium industry. Bolivia is part of the lithium triangle with Argentina and Chile. They call it the ABC: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile. These salars, these salt flats regions, which kind of exist on the border where those three countries come together. And Elon Musk famously said in response, quote, "We will coup whoever we want." And this is one of the clearest examples of the ideology that underlies someone like Elon Musk, this billionaire who's responsible for several of the largest corporations in the world, and who has an ideology driven by technological progress, or what we could call technological escalation. I know you've talked a lot in your interviews and your work. We talked about it previously last time I was on the show, Lewis Mumford and democratic versus authoritarian technics. Elon Musk is the poster child for authoritarian technics, this technological approach that's inherently unsustainable, that's highly centralized, and that both emerges from and contributes back to centralization of power in this sort of never-ending cycle, or doom spiral, you could call it, of increasing authoritarianism, control, and exploitation. And that's what we've seen with Tesla, just as with so many other corporations around the world. Is, most of Tesla's nickel, for example, they've stopped using nickel in some of their batteries, but they still use it in others, from what I understand. Most of their nickel comes from Indonesia. And Indonesia's nickel mining is notoriously destructive, tearing through jungle ecosystems. On the island of Halmahera in Indonesia, there's an uncontacted tribe, the Hangana Manyawa tribe, who are living, a hunter-gatherer lifestyle in the jungle. And this nickel mining company is destroying their jungle. They're encroaching on this uncontacted indigenous tribe to extract nickel for electric vehicle batteries for some of the wealthiest people in the world. We're in a situation where there are something like 1.2 billion cars in the world, which means that less than 1 in 7 people on the planet even has access to a car. It's probably far less. It's probably more like 1 in 10 when you count corporate fleets and so on. So say 1 in 10 people has access to a car on the planet. And if you think about electric cars, which tend to be generally quite a bit more expensive than gasoline-powered cars, this is a luxury good. This is a luxury good. When we talk about extracting lithium to produce electric vehicles, we're talking about a luxury item that is only available to perhaps the richest 1 to 5% of the world's population at the current level. And just to be clear, yes, there's lithium in cell phones. Yes, there's lithium in other types of batteries and products. But if you talk about quantity, the amount that's in an electric car battery compared to a laptop or a tablet or anything like that is it's orders of magnitude larger. And that's the major driver of growing lithium demand around the world for now. Although energy storage, grid energy storage for batteries is rising rapidly as well.
But anyone sensible that should know about history would hear Elon Musk's comment as genocidal. That's patently genocidal. He did write back. This was reported by Telesur, I think, or Vijay Prasad or somebody. He said he was joking, and he said that we get our lithium from Australia. That's the same thing. Australia is an indigenous occupied country area. But I want to go. There's not just Musk. I mean, we're talking about, as I mentioned, there was Tech Dirt, the preeminent entrepreneur was Columbus, genocidal maniac. Ayn Rand, the objectivist philosopher, gave a lecture. I think it was may have been in 1978. I think it was at the Military Academy in Annapolis, and she basically says that the Native Americans don't deserve to have the land. They should be eliminated. They should have been eliminated like they were, which also caused a bit of even from the military, were concerned about this particular comment. These people say this outright in the media, and yet this still goes on. It can't be denied. In other words, it can't be denied that this stuff is in the mainstream. Paul Ryan was the secretary of majority leader or something like that. What are people thinking in middle class? They have the information. There's activists there going to jail.
Mm-hmm.
What are the social conditions, and what would it take for mass movements to actually form from people that are already complicit with a system like this?
Yeah, well, I wanna answer your question, but you might have to remind me because I want to say something else first. But I want to make sure we get back.
I got notes.
But just on the point that you just made, the most recent essay I wrote, I titled it "The Scientific Dispassionate Racism of Lithium Americas Corporation."
Okay.
And what I was trying to communicate there is that the ideology of progress, this progressive ideology that underlies both conservative and liberal political traditions in places like the United States. I don't know about Korea as much or other parts of the world. But this ideology of progress, which says that technological and societal evolution is taking place in a linear fashion from uncivilized, pre-civilized people who didn't have technology, who didn't have writing, who didn't have the wheel, who didn't have, these modern technologies that we have today, modern medicine and so on, that there is a linear development path from that to agricultural societies, from agricultural societies to growing complexity with the spread of writing and so on, to the development of universities, to industrialism, the increasing harnessing of the energy of the planet through machinery and technology and industry, the steam engine and fossil fuels and so on, and to technological society, where we're at now, to the computer age. And that linear development drive is a moral good that is unquestioned, that is completely unquestioned, that is so deeply embedded in our psyche that questioning that is unthinkable. And I think this is so important because when you have those types of beliefs that are so deep down in your psychology that you don't even think about them, you don't even question them, that it becomes so much easier to justify atrocities. Like what is happening right now on the island of Halmahera to the Hungana Manyawa tribe is no different to what happened when Columbus came to the Americas in 1492, to what's now called the Americas, Turtle Island, right? It is no different. Columbus came over with an economic imperative to extract profit for the sake of growing a westernized, civilized society. And behind that, there was also the ideological and spiritual imperative of bringing Christianity and saving the souls. That was a discussion that was used very often in these communities at the time.
Right. I mean, in this interview, we're talking mostly about science, but there was, of course, Catholicism and Christianity.
Right. Which isn't to say that it was all. I mean, Bartolome de las Casas was speaking out against it, so there wasn't a unified perspective speaking out against the genocide, against the indigenous people of this continent and so on. So it wasn't a unified perspective among Christians and Catholics and so on. There was opposition from the very beginning, and I think it's important to point that out. But the point that I want to make here is, again, I titled this The Scientific Dispassionate Racism, because this ideology of progress says that if you want to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. If you want an electric car, you might have to destroy some rainforest. If you want energy storage batteries to solve the global warming crisis created by the very society that's talking about this, then you might have to destroy some uncontacted indigenous peoples' territories, and you might have to wipe them out. They might get diseases. They might get their habitat destroyed that they need for food and medicine and survival. That you might have to bulldoze and destroy sacred sites like Thacker Pass, significant animal habitat for endangered and threatened species. That this is just the cost of doing business. And you know what? It's distasteful. We don't necessarily like it, but you have to do it in order to keep progressing forward. That is the ideology that I think is so dangerous.
Max, we're talking about, okay, so we're talking about a progression here from manifest destiny, which is the God-given right to take the land, basically, but it had a moral and imperative to it, to a scientific equivalent of manifest destiny, which is what you're describing.
Yeah.
And now, even on top of this, we're getting techno-utopianism, which is the same thing. It's just a more highly refined example.
Yeah, and I talk about this in the article that I wrote as a form of ethnocentrism. It is a worldview that says my culture, the culture that I grew up in, is the best way to live, and that disregards other ways of being. And this is the value, as so many people have discovered through history, of cultural exchange, building real relationships with people who live in very different ways than you do, than you grew up. This is the value of, the field of cultural anthropology that studies cultures from a scientific perspective, trying to be more objective and not say that one is better than the other, but just look at them. How are cultures organized? What are the results of certain forms of social organization? What comes about when a society goes in this direction versus that direction, and why does that happen? These questions, I think, are very, very important. And in the West, in technological societies, the ethnocentrism, this sort of ethnocentrism is absolutely rampant. It is rampant. And it is so unquestioned that, people like myself and you who speak out and question the progress imperative are looked at as stupid, are sometimes face criminalization, death threats, physical violence, and of course people who can be put in jail, and of course people who defend the land and act in opposition to this progress imperative are often killed in places around the world.
Right. They're not, where we have some privileges, right? You and I have some privilege. We're not killed when we say this.
Hundreds of people are being killed every year for opposing this imperative. And that's just the people who are being directly killed for standing up for it. We're not talking about people being killed by air pollution. We're not talking about people being killed by the preponderance of the Western diet and the impacts that's having on people's health around the world. We're not talking about the harm being done to people psychologically and physically by living in technological societies to which our bodies and our minds are profoundly ill-adapted. A lot of evolutionary biologists and physiologists have lots of data about that. And crucially, we're not talking about the future costs that are not yet here, but are coming rapidly. The impacts on our children, our grandchildren, and future generations that are becoming more and more unavoidable as the future is being impoverished by choices that are being made now. As soils are being destroyed, air is being polluted, the climate's being destroyed, biodiversity is crashing, the oceans are falling to pieces ecologically, and in general, the fabric of life on this planet is fraying. That future cost is unthinkable. It's unimaginable in its scope. And if we don't, this is why, the Iroquois Confederacy and their constitution talked about 7 generations in the future, and they meant that in some ways as a metaphor, right? They were literally talking about 7 generations, but also they were talking about all future generations. We need to make our decisions with all future generations in mind. And that was a political principle and cultural principle encoded into the society deliberately to help people make smart, sustainable decisions for the future. We don't have anything like that in the dominant culture today. And in fact, we have the opposite. We have an economic and political system that rewards people who take short-sighted actions that actually steal from and destroy the future in favor of short-term goals.
I want to make just a, a qualifying comment that for people that are listening, that Max and I are not just totally just saying that the indigenous people are all good and all of that. What Max and I are, in fact, Max talked about the internecine butchery that went on between some of the tribes there. What Max and I are talking about when we say the indigenous model is the democratic confederalism of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, the Wendat, the Eastern Woodland Indians, the Northern California. So I just want people to know that when we talk about the indigenous model, it's a democratic confederalism that would look a lot like bioregionalism today, or what we call bioregionalism. I want to kind of move to the end here, but I wanted to say that you had told me, I have a number of, we could go on and on here. You have a number of comments that you made. One is that likely we're not going to get out of the situation such as preventing climate change, but you say we need to, I think you used the term, mold the situation that we have into a direction of salvaging what we can of wild nature. Am I quoting you correctly or something like that?
Yeah, well, more broadly talking about ecological collapse, of which climate change is a part. It's really challenging for us to wrap our minds around this right now, but any organism or ecosystem or system that is growing will reach its peak. It will be largest in size right before it begins to decline. So I say this because things feel so normal right now. Most economies around the world are doing pretty well. Most
They're actually doing well, right?
Economies are doing great. They're growing. There's plenty of jobs. I mean, not for all people, but there's jobs. There's money circulating. There's growth. There's new buildings. There's new technologies. Everything seems normal. And things are at their highest point before they begin to decline. And I don't know exactly when that decline will begin in terms of our societies, but I do know that ecologically speaking, we are well into collapse. We are well along the path of collapse. It's not a future situation. Ecological collapse is happening right now. Whether you look at insect populations, songbird populations, fish populations in the ocean, soil health, the number of oceanic dead zones and the size of them in the oceans, global warming and the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the melting of glaciers, the amount of old growth forest across the planet. Whatever measure of ecological health you look at, they're all headed in the wrong direction.
That's
and
right.
This reflects the fact that ecological collapse is not a future scenario. It's been going on for centuries. We are deep into the process of ecological collapse. Those of us who live in wealthy countries are protected from the impacts of that collapse by high energy consumption and by military force, essentially. But if you're living in Pakistan right now, you are not generally insulated from ecological collapse. If you're wealthy, of course you are, but if you're living in a rural agricultural area or if you're poor, living on the fringes of society, you're not protected from ecological collapse. If you're living in the small island nations, ecological collapse, global warming, sea level rise is literally lapping at your doorstep. If you're living on a mountainside and your streams are going dry as the glaciers are melting, my point is that for billions of people around the planet, ecological collapse is affecting them immediately right now in very serious ways. And for those of us who live in the West, who our food comes to us through industrial systems, who rely on advanced technological economies for our well-being and our livelihoods, we're protected in many ways from this for now. But the collapse is ongoing. And so for me, there is no doubt that the society we live in, this globalized technological civilization, is not going to last. It's inevitable that it will fall, it will change, it will be transformed by circumstances outside of its control. That's
Right.
been the trend.
This is not just your opinion. I've got stacks of papers, large body of scientific evidence. The scientists are saying exactly what you're saying.
Yep, absolutely. And people have been discussing this issue for decades. It's not a new conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
What I like to bring to the table is that if that collapse is inevitable, if it's already happening and this way of life is not going to last, the question becomes for us, what is a moral action in the face of that? How do we respond to this situation? And the way that I like to analyze that is to think of collapse as having both positive and negative aspects. So the collapse of the global industrial economy, for example, would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. That's a good thing. We generally support that, right? It would also result in the collapse of healthcare systems, which generally most of us don't support that, right? That's a bad thing. It would result in probably significant reductions in overfishing in the oceans. And the oceans would likely begin to recover from things like oceanic dead zones as industrial fertilizers became infeasible to use, fossil fuel fertilizers. Those are good things. Those are positive for the planet. At the same time, the industrial agricultural food system would collapse, which means, that's how most of us survive. That's bad. How do we respond to these things? How do we manage this crisis as it begins to play out? And how do we try to shape the form of this collapse that we're moving deeper into, in positive directions? How do we try and emphasize the positive aspects of it and mitigate or prevent the negative aspects from playing out? So, for example, I often talk about things like relocalizing our food systems. I think that's a very important response. Both it has a lot of ecological positive effects if we're talking about organic agriculture, permaculture, agroecology, these types of systems. I'm not an expert in any of those things, but they are far preferable to industrial agriculture. They may still have an impact on the land in some cases. It's not as good as an old growth forest for ecology, but you can produce food and habitat and sequester carbon and filter water, and there are these positive effects of that, right? At the same time, I'm a big advocate for resistance work, for working to stop the destruction of the planet directly, whether that's working to stop pipelines, working to stop mining activities, working to stop fracking, logging, all of these various activities that are destroying our planet. They need to be stopped. They're not stopping themselves, at least not fast enough to make a difference to the destruction that's happening. So I'm a big advocate for a multi-tiered approach towards this crisis, where on one level, we're working to relocalize food production, build alternative medical systems, figure out ways to do sustainable housing, address the overpopulation crisis in humane and dignified ways that respect people. And and otherwise, build an alternative way of life to relying on fossil fuels and industrial civilization. At the same time, we're working to proactively shut down the industries that are destroying the planet. Because if we don't do so fast, then things are just going to be worse and worse in the future. The faster we shut down these industries, the more the climate will remain relatively livable, perhaps. The more biodiversity will remain, the more forests will remain, the more fish in the oceans, and so on.
I like what you're saying, but not only are we getting more renewable energy, good or bad, but we know that it's destructive. We're not only getting more of that, we're getting more of all forms of energy, whether it's a biomass burning more trees. Fossil fuels are not parabolic, but they're on a dramatic increase. This is a serious, serious crisis. I want to make a statement, get your response, and then a final question after that. I know I've taken a lot of your time here. I really appreciate it. We've done a marathon, and I hope that people listening in get a good understanding of the topics from history to activism to what's going on. The economist, famous economist, neoclassical, says that I'm quoting him roughly, that something like the economy is not a problem because about 90% of the actual production is occurring indoors. That's one comment. As an addition to that, Tesla says it wants to produce X number of cars by 2030. I've got from the Financial Times, they had a series on, or they had a segment on moral money, by the way. That's the name of their series, Inside the Global Race for Lithium Batteries. Now, I want to quote an investor. This is an investment company right at the core of this system. But Brian Mennel says that Tesla wants to go to 20 million EV cars, electric vehicle cars, and he says that this will be we will need 7 times the total global annual supply of lithium that we have today. Now, tell me, how is it that a leading economist says that 90% of production is occurring indoors, and we're going to need 7 times the amount of lithium to make these batteries, to make these cars? I mean, is my reasoning wrong? Do I have a problem with induction or deduction, or what's going on?
Well, this is the problem with most economists, is they're completely divorced from reality. And what I mean by that is, I believe it's Vaclav Smil. It might be somebody else, but I think it's Vaclav Smil, who's a sort of a material and energy scientist, studies these issues, who talks about oil as being the master resource. He calls it the master resource. And what he means by that is that oil facilitates transportation. It facilitates the extraction of other resources, powering chainsaws and mining trucks and ships carrying other oil supplies and other types of commodities across the ocean and so on. So he calls it the master resource in that it enables everything else. So that's the first thought that comes to mind when I think about these economists saying 90% of the economy is indoors, so it's no problem for the natural world. Let's just deal with the other 10%. The problem is that 90% is impossible without the 10%, because the 10% is the oil that makes it possible to have a light switch, to turn on your computer, to have electricity running through the grid to the computers on which all those people are doing their work. That the oil and the natural gas and the coal are what bring the fertilizers to the fields that feed all those people doing the 90% of the work indoors. Are these raw materials like lithium, iron ore, bauxite for aluminum, all the mining that goes on around the world in that 10% of the extractive economy? That's what creates the computers. That's what creates the communications grids. So I think it's when you're an economist, it's easy to get caught up in numbers and forget that we are animals living on a physical planet that consume physical items, resources from the planet around us, that we're completely reliant on the natural world for every bite of food, every breath of air, all our clothing, everything on my desk and on yours, the internet lines that are connecting us right now across the Pacific Ocean, all of that comes from the planet and is completely dependent upon the natural world in one way or another. And we've seen these types of predictions around massive growth in lithium mining, copper extraction, all different kinds of mining to support a increasingly renewable energy economy. What's often ignored is that, as the engineer Ozzie Zahner says, we shouldn't call them alternative energies. We should call them alternative fossil fuels, because they're impossible to build and maintain without a fossil fuel economy. And to give a very concrete example of that, at Thacker Pass, the lithium that they plan to produce at Thacker Pass will be extracted, I mentioned this earlier, using sulfuric acid. And you can create sulfuric acid using sulfur, large quantities of sulfur. The main industrial source of sulfur is oil refining, and especially high sulfur fuels like the Alberta tar sands and other forms of, they call it sour crude, because it's very high in sulfur. They refine out this sulfur because if you burn oil that's high in sulfur, you form basically sulfuric acid in the atmosphere when it reacts with oxygen, and you get acid rain. So, 20, 30, 40 years ago, there were major acid rain problems all around the world. There were entire forests dying, houses were being destroyed, all these issues caused by huge amounts of acid rain because all this sulfur was being burned in gasoline and diesel and so on. So now all the refineries, they pull the sulfur out. And so they have these big piles of yellow sulfur accumulating outside the refineries, and they sell that sulfur to other industries. So sulfur, what that means is that Lithium Americas at Thacker Pass will be buying sulfur from an oil refinery as the main chemical input to allow them to extract the lithium to produce electric vehicle batteries. They will be sending money to these oil refineries and buying that sulfur. And we're not talking about a small amount of sulfur here. The Thacker Pass lithium mine, if folks have been to New York City or are familiar with the Empire State Building, we're talking an amount of sulfur equivalent in size to 2 Empire State Buildings per year being brought into Thacker Pass from oil extraction. That is a massive material input from the oil industry. Now, of course, there are other ways to get sulfur, mainly mining it out of volcanoes and so on. I know that happens in Indonesia and some places around the world, but the scale of direct sulfur mining like that is minuscule compared to the amount that comes out of oil and gas refining. That is the main source of the vast majority of industrial sulfur around the world. And that's a direct input to the Thacker Pass mine. Of course, they're also using massive dump trucks with 200-gallon fuel tanks to dig up and haul the raw material around. They're using diesel-powered semi-trucks to bring the lithium down to the train. The train is burning fossil fuels to carry it to ports and to other locations. The entire supply chain is built around fossil fuels. And that's not even to go into the coal that is burned to smelt iron ore to create the lithium mining equipment, to create the steel that's in the trucks, that's in the bulldozers, that's in the backhoes and the diggers and the buildings and the processing facilities and the sulfuric acid tanks and the rail lines themselves. Of course, technologically oriented people will know that there's work being done to try and decarbonize steel production and remove coal from supply chains for steel and so on. This work is totally theoretical at this point. It's not happening. It's happening in labs. It's experimental. And it's not being done at anything near the scale needed to reduce fossil fuel inputs on these industries. And that is why, as you said, Layne, we are seeing growth in renewable energy, and we're also seeing massive growth in fossil fuels.
So in other words, 99.99999, however much percent of the economy is actually happening outdoors. It's actually in the Earth. Max, I want to thank you for your analytical inputs and moral inputs. I have a final question for you, just a human question. What does the land mean to you
Mm,
as a human being?
mm. Well, thanks for having me, Layne. I appreciate being here. It's always great. I enjoy our conversations. It's nice to dive in on a bit more technical level with somebody who has that perspective on these issues as well. What does the land mean to me? Well, I live in rural Oregon. I'm looking out my window right now at an oak tree. It's a Gary oak or an Oregon white oak. And it's probably about 80 years old. And this land was clear cut about 80 years ago. None of the trees here are older than that. And that tree, just by living, just by existing, is making the world a better place. It's creating oxygen, it's sequestering carbon, it is filtering water, it's providing habitat and food to other creatures. And when it dies, it will perhaps provide even more life than it did when it was alive, because insects will eat it and woodpeckers will make holes in it, and it will decay and worms will, and so that will feed the whole cycle of life. People can live in these reciprocal ways too. And for most of our life on this planet as a species, we have lived in these types of ways. Sure, we're going to cause impacts wherever we go, just like when the first human beings showed up on islands like Aotearoa, New Zealand, right? They caused extinctions. That's somewhat predictable because we're an apex predator. We're a large species. If wolves had reached New Zealand, they would have caused a lot of extinctions too, right? That's the way things go. There's change in nature. But certain societies learn how to live in ways that are reciprocal with the land. That doesn't mean they make no mistakes. That doesn't mean they're perfect people. That doesn't mean that I'd want to be friends with all of them. I don't want to romanticize people like you were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
But certain societies make deliberate choices that lead to sustainable ways of life over the long term. And that's how I want to lead my life. So when I think about some of my biggest inspirations and the beings who I look up to most in the world, a lot of them are not human beings. They're trees like this oak tree. That tree is an inspiration to me. That is a reminder that we don't have to be destructive. We don't have to live in ways that are causing, slavery and human rights violations in different places around the world, like the Congo or Indonesia or Thacker Pass or Argentina. We don't have to destroy the land by the way we live. We can just exist. We can live with frugal abundance, as the saying goes. And so, when I think about my personal relationship to the land, years ago, Derek Jensen, who I know you've also interviewed and who's been on this show, I first heard him speak, and he talked about listening to the land. And he said that he didn't mean that as a metaphor. He didn't mean it as some, woo-woo spirituality thing. He meant it in a very real and direct way. Go out and listen to the land, and know the land is not going to speak to you in English or Korean. The tree is not going to all of a sudden start talking out loud.
We're not going to go do age here.
Right. But we can observe. We can observe the land. We can watch and listen and learn by how a tree lives, by what are the relationships between the different creatures that live in and around that tree. And over years, over lifetimes, we can learn from these other beings. We can observe how they live. And this is why, so many cultures around the world had this idea of human beings as sort of being the younger brothers of other life forms on this planet. That's an explicit recognition that for all of our intellect and all of our cleverness and our intelligence, that is a great gift that we have, but it's also very dangerous, right? It's like a kid who has an incredible amount of intelligence, and you have to tell them, you have to help them to use that intelligence for good, right?
Mhm.
Because left to their own devices, they might be really mean. They might abuse their friends. They might make fun of people. They might lie and cheat and steal, in order to get ahead. Because all of us have this, um, this latent, um, this latent thing within us where we can do things that are wrong. We can take advantage of people, right? And that's the biggest thing that I learned from the natural world, by listening, by paying attention, by going out and just sitting quietly in a forest or on the beach or on a meadow, is this humility to say that for all of my intelligence and all of my human skills, which are amazing, human beings are amazing animals, amazing creatures, we need to be humble, and we need to understand that we are not more or less important than any other form of life on this planet, that we are a participant in a bigger process, and that when we try to impose ourselves on the planet, then ultimately we are being self-destructive as well as destroying everything else. Whereas we have a different choice. We can live in different ways. Not easy to do. We've dug ourselves into a very deep hole from where we are right now. But that just means there's a lot of good work to be done in the world. So, for everyone listening, I know you've been involved in that type of work for decades, Layne, and so have I. And there's a lot to be done, and there's a lot that we can all do. And that's a real blessing to be able to live in a world where we have a chance to make the world a better place. It's not a boring time to be alive, that's for sure.
Max, thanks so much for your time. Been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you again, Layne. Appreciate it.
I've been speaking with Max Wilbert, a writer and biocentric community organizer, bioregionalist. He's part of grassroots political work for many decades and is the founder of Protect Thacker Pass. I'm Layne Hartsell with Korea IT Times.